This episode is brought to you by Buffalo Trace Distillery. Powerful yet smooth. Contained but never tame. Proudly going their own way, but never going alone. This is the spirit inside Buffalo Trace Bourbon. Made at Buffalo Trace Distillery, the world's most award-winning distillery. Buffalo Trace is always perfectly untamed. Distilled, aged, and bottled by Buffalo Trace Distillery, Franklin County, Kentucky. 90 proof, 45% alcohol by volume. Learn more at buffalotracedistillery.com. Please drink responsibly.
First of all, I just want to say Happy Canada Day to all of my fellow Canadian followers and listeners. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, now in its second year from the Weather Network in Canada. It was on July 1st, 1863. One of the largest military conflicts in North American history started when the Union and Confederate forces collided at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. This day in weather history. In all the history books and movies made about this infamous period, there is rarely much romanticized about how much the weather played in its events. So today we do that. I've studied this battle before in American history, and it was considered one of the turning points of the American Civil War. The Battle of Gettysburg is said to be the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil, with an estimated 50,000 casualties. There have been countless books written, documentaries produced, university courses taught, reenactments staged, and movies made dedicated to this exact 3 days in American history while the country was still struggling for an identity. But have you ever seen a film on a Gettysburg, Pennsylvania man by the name of Reverend Dr. Michael Jacobs? I thought not. He didn't carry a musket or a bayonet. He did not lay charges or scout for enemy movement on the battlefield. He was a math professor in what was at the time called Pennsylvania College. But this is where I got excited about the story. He had a strong interest in weather and recorded his observations 3 times a day, every day, including during the battle. Dr. Jacobs' observations from this time would result in the book Meteorology of the Battle. Welcome to year 2 of this podcast. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider. But there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective. And oftentimes, they will include visuals from that day's event, from when it happened, in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. On July 1st, the first day of fighting began. It was mainly overcast with cumulus-stratus clouds. There was almost no wind at all, and overall conditions were otherwise mild at 24 degrees Celsius and humid, with the light breezes coming from the south. The second day started with a similar cloud cover, but Reverend Dr. Jacobs wrote that the sky was mainly clear by the afternoon, and the temperatures rose to 27. All right, this is where I put my weather nerd hat on. We have rising temperatures. They're coming in from the south, so therefore humidity is rising. But with virtually no cloud cover and open fields at that time in history, we're looking at solar loading, where the ground is now baking in unobstructed sunlight, heating the surface and raising the convective available potential energy levels. This is always a precursor to stronger thunderstorms. But no one on the battlefield would have a clue about this because Dr. Jacobs was only learning this as it happened. The third day. Mainly sunny, wide open skies by the afternoon was noted in his journals. So we're in the clear, right? No. Of the few clouds that remained, however, Dr. Jacobs noted there was the massive thundercloud of summer. That would be a towering cumulonimbus. So when the storm started around 6 p.m. that day, Reverend Dr. Jacobs wrote, the thunder seemed tame after the artillery firing of the afternoon. So there was artillery fire, meaning there was an ugly battle. For the wounded that still lay on the field, the cloud cover from the storm clouds and the rain may have felt welcome and almost soothing. But some wounded soldiers, reportedly all Confederate, had still not been moved from the low-lying areas by the Plum Run Creek, which in the sudden rain on the likely dry, hard surface flooded very easily and overflowed its banks. They all drowned. According to Civil War historian Lee Rainey, An even larger issue that was faced as a result of the rain was the retreat attempts made by the Confederate Army the next day, on July 4th. Apparently, the soldiers had to traipse almost 30 kilometers with a long train of wagons filled with wounded soldiers over what were now dissolving dirt roads in the rain. Also, remember the emphasis I made on the rising temperature of the days? These soldiers were wearing very heavy uniforms. And although this was not unusual for their time, it's kind of like saying to people who live in winter that, you get used to it. Let me tell you something. No, you don't. And these soldiers were in heavy wool with artillery and supplies on top of that. As a result, heat stroke and heat exhaustion would likely have affected many soldiers. So yeah, I'd say the weather played a rather pivotal role in how the American Civil War wrapped up the next day. That started on July 1st, 1863, on this day in weather history. Tomorrow is July 2nd, and on this day in weather history, we ask if you'd be interested in a movie titled Gatornado. Alligators can get up to 14 feet long and weigh 1,000 pounds. So what if one actually and literally rained down on top of you? Find out tomorrow right here on This Day in Weather History with me, your host, Chris May.